Republican versus Democrat, the Black History Lesson. The history of politics in America hasn't always included African Americans. History tells us that when black people were finally allowed to vote, they voted for the Republican Party, who at the time formed to oppose the extension of slavery. Although up until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans pledged not to interfere with slavery in states where it existed. Neither the Democratic nor the Republican parties of today are like their 19th century forebears. By the late 1960s, the National Democratic Party had abandoned its former support for legal segregation and enjoyed strong support from black voters, while Republicans had embraced a white backlash to voting and civil rights to build their party in the South. The Democrats were often called conservative and embraced that label. Many of them wanted things to be like they were in the past, just like the Republicans want today in 2020. White members of the GOP solicited black votes, but often dragged their feet on issues of importance to African Americans. Black Southern politicians managed to achieve some goals, most notably the expansion of public education, but often found themselves frustrated by their white colleagues and hesitancy on other matters like civil rights. And despite the critical importance of black voters to the Southern GOP, white Republicans monopolized major political offices. Some of them did not have a problem sharing power with black people. They thought it was okay for black men to vote, but they didn't want them to hold power. African Americans remained active in the Republican Party and for a time kept voting and civil rights at the forefront of the party's agenda. With the rise of a new generation of white Republicans, more were interested in big business than racial equality, made the party less attractive for blacks. Republicans started taking the black vote for granted. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South, which began just before the United States' entry into World War I, brought many black people into cities where they could not vote freely and get in touch with local democratic organizations that slowly realized the value of the black vote. The devastation of the Great Depression, combined with the promises of programs of the New Deal, led black voters into the Democratic Party. The majority of black voters supported Franklin D. Roosevelt for president in 1936. The passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 led to an even greater shift toward Democrats who supported both measures. It is true that the first 23 black members of Congress were Republicans, but those facts are misleading about a complicated history and ignores nearly a century in which both Democrats and Republicans underwent major changes as parties. The history of politics in America hasn't always included African Americans. History tells us that when black people were finally allowed to vote, they voted for the Republican Party, who at the time formed to oppose the extension of slavery. Although up until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans pledged not to interfere with slavery in states where it existed. Neither the Democratic nor the Republican parties of today are like their 19th century forebears. By the late 1960s, the National Democratic Party had abandoned its former support for legal segregation and enjoyed strong support from black voters, while Republicans had embraced a white backlash to voting and civil rights to build their party in the South. Black people who could vote tended to support the Republican Party from the 1860s to the 1930s. Republicans pledged to protect voting rights. African Americans viewed the party as the only vessel for their goals. The Democratic Party for most of the 19th century was a white supremacist organization that gave no welcome to black Americans. That brings us to today. As we can see currently in 2020, the Republican Party is still more interested in big business than racial equality. The party has also shifted to the far, far right. We have a president who supports white supremacy and never has the guts to denounce it. He hasn't paid his taxes, grabbed women by their crotches, called white supremacists fine people, made fun of the disabled, said Americans who died in war are losers and suckers, dismissed Russia interference in the election, imposed a Muslim travel ban, encouraged police officers to be rough with people they arrest, attacked former prisoner of war John McCain and called him a loser. And of course, the mishandling of one of the worst pandemics in world history, the coronavirus. There's a lot more, but I think you get the point. In the last election, I lost a lot of friendships because I took the stance that if you support Republican Party or vote Republican, then you are the same as Trump. How can you as a Republican say you're not a racist, but your boss is, and you support everything he does and says? Let me put this in a different context. If you found out your boss at work was raping women and hanging out with white supremacists, would you continue to support him and go to court and stand next to him in his defense and donate money to his legal fund and vote for him to keep his job and position? Well then, ask yourself, how can you support a Republican Party that stands by this man who supports nothing but hate? So let's dive into some facts. As of May 2020, Gallup polling found that 31% of Americans identified as Democrats, 25% as Republicans, and 40% as independents. Republicans hold an advantage in party identification among several groups of voters, including white men without a college degree, people living in rural communities in the South, and those who frequently attend religious services. The Democratic candidate for president over the 5 presidential elections since 2000 has averaged 91% of the black vote, with 8% on an average going to the Republican candidate. Presidential horse race polling so far this year shows no indication of significant variation from this historical pattern. A recent Wall Street Journal NBC News poll found Biden leading Trump among black voters by 90% to 5%. Nearly 8 out of 10 of the richest families in America are Republicans. 6 out of 10 of the richest politicians in Congress are Republicans. The fact that lower income Republicans, largely known as the basket of deplorables, support more social spending and tax than the rich is almost hard to believe. It is pretty striking that about a fifth of Republicans have views closer to Democrats than their own party. So why do so many white people vote Republican? Because it's the party of hate. Let's be real again. A lot of Republicans are rich and own businesses and corporations in this country. They don't have to align themselves with the Republican Party. They have enough wealth and power to create their own party or step outside of that party and be independent. But yet and still, election after election, they continue to support not only the party, but their president. So when you hear someone tell you that they are Republican, but they aren't racist, make sure you ask them, how do you support it then? If Republicans really cared about Black Lives Matters, equality, women's rights, human rights, and science, then they would respectfully sit this election out or completely leave that political, racist organization. We as Americans have witnessed the complete moral collapse of a governing party of a world superpower. They are the Trump generation. It's how they will be remembered, like the segregationists of the past. I ask that everyone who have Republican friends or family to start holding them all accountable, starting today. If we say we believe in personal responsibility, you have to take personal responsibility and start with yourself. Because we aren't just playing politics anymore. We are playing with American lives. Go vote.